Thank you, and thank you for having Nicholas and myself here today. Today in the presentation, we're going to cover three main issues. We're going to start with an introduction to potential CO2 removal options, their needs for scaling up, and take a look at what some of the current policies are that we have in place. We're going to look in particular at one specific policy mechanism, and that is the use of offsetting mechanisms for carbon dioxide removal, and explore some of the opportunities and risks associated with that approach. Finally, I will pass on to my colleague Nicholas Höhne, who's going to look at various different net zero targets and how they could be reached in a sustainable manner, both including steep emissions reductions and carbon dioxide removal. But first, I'm going to begin with looking at those different options for carbon dioxide removal, what we need and how we can support that. The various emissions mitigation scenarios from the latest IPCC report on the 1.5 degree target highlight three really key aspects of what we need in the coming century. First of all, we need emissions from all sectors and countries to reduce drastically and in the very near term. They need to reach net zero CO2 emissions by 2050. And in the latter half of this century, we're going to need net negative carbon dioxide. That means that action needs to start soon, and it needs to start now. And it also makes quite clear that we are going to need carbon dioxide removal in the near term and in the long term. The question is, how can we do that sustainably? And how can we do that in a way that also ensures that we reduce emissions in the near time, thereby reducing our dependence on it in the long term? So the key question that we're going to ask in the rest of this presentation is, how can we prepare for net negative emissions without diverting attention from reducing emissions? We already have quite a broad range of options on the table for looking at carbon dioxide removal. Carbon dioxide removal requires two components. It requires capture and it requires storage. And here we're showing a range of different options that either do both of these or combine them in different ways. I'm also showing in here from more greenish shades at the top to bluer at the bottom, a progression from those components that have a more biological basis to those are more technical or geological. Soil carbon and forests, both biological examples, combine both capture and storage in their approach. Carbon is captured from the atmosphere and stored in the same place, be that soil or forests. Another option we have combines both biological options with technical options and capture and storage options. A good example and well-known example being the production of bioenergy from the burning of biomass, such as crops, the capturing of the CO2 that is produced, and storage in various different reservoirs, such as in saline storage underground or through carbon mineralization. A final option that we show here is enhanced weathering. This process essentially enhances a long-term timescale geological process that involves the weathering of rocks. This can be done through the crushing of those rocks, spreading it on fields to enhance the process and speed up the sequestration of CO2. From this overview, I think you can see that we have quite a lot of different options. And the question now is, well, which ones do we want to support and how could we best support them? We may not want to select any one in particular, but a range of options. But it would be helpful to characterize those different approaches to find out what the needs are and what the potential support required would be. And that's something that we've done in some recent work. So for this range of options, and I'd like to stress that this isn't all the options available, but just a selection that we've made to highlight some of the different components that would be worth looking into. In terms of characteristics, what we've looked at includes what the sustainable potential for sequestration is. Here we've focused on potential in 2050 for removals per year. We also need to look into the varying different costs of the different approaches. We need to look into how mature each of the different technologies are. Are they almost ready to go and be scaled up immediately, or is there need for more and additional research and development to get them to a point at which we can actually start using them? The duration of storage of carbon dioxide that each can produce is also important in terms of the policy option that is appropriate for supporting it, and we'll come back to that in a few slides. Finally, it's also really important to look at both the possible co-benefits of the carbon dioxide removal approach and the potential negative effects that could occur at the same time. I don't want to go into detail on all of the different approaches, but I'd just like to highlight a few general patterns or observations that we can make from our analysis. From the first column, you can see that there is quite a lot of uncertainty into the total sustainable potential for some of the different approaches. With bioenergy and carbon capture and storage, for example, the estimates in the literature currently range from 0.5 gigaton to 5 gigatons in 2050. And it's a similar case for costs of the different approaches. There are some that are generally considered cheaper than others. Afforestation and reforestation is generally considered to be cheaper and per ton of CO2 removed than something like direct air capture with carbon capture and storage. But the range of estimates, even between $2 per ton of CO2 and 150, is huge and really has an impact on the type of policy that can support it. We're better able to assess the current level of maturity of different technologies, but we have here quite a range between the different levels of maturity. Afforestation and reforestation from a technical perspective is very well understood and can quite easily be implemented and is being implemented, whereas something like enhanced weathering or mineral carbonation is not at a much earlier stage of development and would therefore need a different type of policy support. Just to highlight a couple of the benefits and potential negative side effects of different CO2 removal approaches. We see, for example, with the biological approaches, including bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, we really need to look into the potential impacts on food security and biodiversity, may they be positive or negative. One potential positive effect of both soil carbon sequestration and biochar would be positive impacts on soil fertility and potentially water. On the more technical end of the spectrum of options that we have, we need to take into consideration the potential energy requirements, for example, for direct air capture with carbon capture and storage that can be quite high. So given these different characteristics, how are we going to support these different options? What we've done for now is to look into what the different options that we have already available. As we think these are a good starting point to expand from and look at how those could be further developed, expanded, or potentially where they're not working so well, seen as a good experiment that we can now move on from. We've grouped the options currently available or currently implemented into 4 broad categories. The first of these is to look into investment in research and innovation. Countries like the UK or the US and the EU as well have substantial major research grants that are supporting various different options. There are also demonstration projects in Japan, the US, and the EU. Another approach, quite broadly taken, is to implement various regulations and standards that incorporate some sort of component of carbon dioxide removal. Examples here include proposed legislation in the US for procuring fuels and building materials. There are also several countries that have set net zero emissions targets, which are much broader regulations and standards, but will need to be further fleshed out and detailed to actually achieve the CO2 removal necessary to reach a net zero target. Finally, we also identified monitoring, reporting, and verification as a potential way in which to standardize and encourage additional carbon dioxide removal, but we haven't yet seen an example of where this has yet been implemented. Governments can also implement various different economic incentives for carbon dioxide removal. These include tax credits, carbon pricing, or emissions reduction credits. A fairly long-standing example comes from Australia, where the Emissions Reduction Fund has done and continues to support various forestry expansion and reforestation. More international mechanisms that also come under this umbrella include the Clean Development Mechanism and the REDD+ mechanism. Finally, we've also seen some recent and expanding funding coming from private sources. This includes seed funding for startups. This is mostly coming from philanthropy or from oil companies. We also see some companies or organizations making voluntary contributions to support carbon dioxide removal. And there is an expanding voluntary market or voluntary carbon market that is also further supporting carbon dioxide removal. These various different existing examples prompted us to look a bit closer into one particular policy mechanism, that is offsetting, as it could potentially provide a strong, consistent support mechanism for supporting CO2 removal. And carbon dioxide removal itself we thought could potentially navigate some of the issues that exist with offsetting when using emissions mitigation from existing fuels. So we thought it's worthwhile looking into this opportunity and policy a bit closer. When assessing offsetting mechanisms, there are 2 aspects that are really important to look at. That is the equivalence of the offset and the integrity of the offset. What I mean by equivalence is that if you emit 1 ton of CO2 and you offset it with a removal or mitigation, that removal or mitigation has to be equivalent. You have to guarantee that that ton of CO2 is also removed. And there are some ways in which we can more rigorously assess the integrity and equivalence of carbon dioxide removal or mitigation for an offsetting scheme. And here I'm going to highlight 4 different elements or aspects that we can work through and questions we can ask to determine if carbon dioxide removal would be suitable for an offset mechanism. The first of these is permanence. Can it be guaranteed that the mitigation, or in this case, removal of CO2, is permanent? The second is additionality. By this, we mean asking the question of whether or not the CO2 removal would have happened anyway without the support for offsetting, or is additional support required, and offsetting is a good mechanism for that. Thirdly, we can ask about the question of leakage. Here, I don't mean leakage from an underground reservoir, but rather the displacement of emissions. A good example would be if I protect one forest, does that just mean that the neighboring forest will be cut down instead? In that case, we have not actually changed the overall picture, rather than just displaced or have leakage for that particular mitigation effort. Finally, monitoring, reporting, and verification has to be robust. There are 2 elements to this. Firstly, how robust are the methods for quantifying the amount of carbon removal? Can we actually compare quantities of carbon dioxide removed versus emitted elsewhere? And secondly, we need to look at whether we can guarantee that the carbon removed is genuine and, again, permanent, coming back again to this permanence issue. So what we can do is, for those various different carbon dioxide removal approaches that we looked at earlier, go through each of these different factors and assess them for offsetting. Here on the left-hand side, I'm going to focus on sort of 3 broad categories of those different approaches. So those are biological capture and storage, that's including the afforestation and reforestation and soil carbon. Those that include some element of underground storage, so here bioenergy with CCS and direct air capture with CCS. And finally, a mineral storage option. So be that through an approach including enhanced weathering or mineral carbonation. When it comes to permanence, we find that the biological options are extremely vulnerable. They could quite easily be reversed through either natural disasters or events such as insects or fires, or also through human intervention again. It's quite difficult to guarantee that a forest that has been planted will be preserved and long-lasting. The permanence for underground storage is possible, but potentially not guaranteed. I think there is still some research out there to be further evaluated. And we found that enhanced weathering or the mineral storage options are a bit more likely to be a permanent storage. In terms of additionality, we found that biological options, again, do not rate particularly well on this factor. There's quite a low to medium probability that any efforts would be additional. And this is partly due to the lower costs. In comparison, the underground storage and mineral storage options are more expensive, and it's more likely that those approaches or any efforts in CO2 removal performed through those approaches would be additional to what would be done under current circumstances. Thirdly, we look at this leakage or displacement of emissions. Again, the biological options are much more vulnerable to leakage as compared to the underground storage or mineral storage options. And finally, for MRV, we find challenges pretty much across the board. The biological options are extremely complex and difficult to verify, and the others are also somewhat uncertain, although we did see in our research that it might be possible to address some of these issues that currently exist and maybe improve on that. But to conclude from our general overview of these different approaches, we find that most offsetting criteria are not met by existing CO2 removal approaches. It's also worthwhile to take a broader perspective on an offsetting scheme. It's part of a support mechanism for carbon dioxide removal. And that is coming back to our first slide, where we said that the most important thing is that emissions are reduced soon and quickly. That is, that claims of carbon neutrality through offsetting could detract from the need for real emissions reductions in the near term. Again, we need to do both. We need to scale up our carbon dioxide removal, but at the same time, implement mitigation options in the near term. If any offsetting schemes were to be used for carbon dioxide removal, stringent safeguards would need to be put in place to ensure that the integrity of any offset credits is actually guaranteed. And in this case, those safeguards really would need to address the permanence of removals. I think through all of the assessments that we looked at here, it's the permanence of the removals that's a particular concern. And that comes back again to this equivalence principle. If the removal itself is not permanent, then it is not equivalent to a ton of CO2 emitted. Given these potential challenges with offsetting, it's worth then looking at a broader policy perspective and also looking at how countries are currently addressing carbon dioxide removal. To do that, my colleague Niklas Hörner is going to walk us through various options for designing a net zero target and how that can be done in a good manner to ensure that we have both ambitious near-term mitigation and successful long-term CO2 removal policies. Niklas.